Okay, we are in a new book of the Bible. We're in the book of Numbers, which is Bamidbar, and that's also the name of this Haftarah. We're in Hosea chapter 1, starting with verse 10, and then we go to chapter 2, verse 23. Now, Hosea, that's quite a book. It's been one of my favorites. Probably because it illustrates how relentless the love that God has for us is. You know, the love he has for us as wayward people. I know we've talked about Hosea before, way back when we were in Genesis. It was the Haftarah for Vayetze from Genesis 28. And that covered, I think it was the last 2 chapters of the book. And back then I had pointed out how I like to read Hosea because it's like it's a good reminder of how far that the Israelites had strayed from God, in what areas they had strayed. And I would read it so that I would have a reminder of these are the things not to do, right? So I believe this is the only other time that Hosea shows up as one of the Haftarahs. So here we are in Hosea, but we're in the beginning, chapter 1 of Hosea. Now it starts at verse 10, like I said, but I would suggest that you start at the very beginning of chapter 1. And if you haven't read this Haftarah yet, go ahead and read it. Now, I do want to read something to you from chapter 2 that starts in verse 14, because there's this beautiful wooing and a promise. And it starts out saying, "Behold, I will allure her and take her to the wilderness and speak tenderly to her." Now, let me pause there. So we've got this wilderness motif, right? And that's the tie-in with the Torah portion this week, because we're in the book of Numbers, and Torah portion's called Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And then it goes on in Hosea to say, "There I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband," which is the word Ishi, my husband, "and you will no longer call me my master," and in Hebrew that's Baali, for Baal. And then it says, the very next verse, it says, "I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice. In love and compassion, I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord." And that word acknowledge is more like you will intimately know and be known by the Lord. So those are some beautiful passages of restoration and redemption, right? And I love reading those because they're kind of like an anchor of hope and help that gets me through some of my harder days. Okay. So speaking of hard days, Hosea has some hard times in this Haftarah, doesn't he? So Hosea's kind of taking the role of God in God's saga of humanity's betrayal and then return. So basically, Hosea and Gomer's the woman that he's to marry, they sort of enact this prophecy that points to the pain that God feels over our sin when we run to something that is other than him. And we've talked about all those different things that might be in some of the earlier lessons. What is it to be chased after something other than him? So Hosea and Gomer are sort of acting this out, where Gomer kind of takes on the role of God and we're Gomer, right? And it speaks of God's covenantal love that he exhibits toward us despite our waywardness, I guess I could say. Now, I only want to read those lovely passages about restoration and return. But this particular part of Hosea is full of Hosea's pain, because he's betrayed by someone that he does very much love. And in this Haftarah, he's in that intense moment, that intense suffering, and he's kind of at this crossroads, am I going to walk away from Gomer this time, or am I going to forgive again? And that's a hard crossroads to be in. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of speculation and debate and discussion over why would God put Hosea in this position to marry Gomer the way that he did, knowing this unfaithfulness of Gomer. And so when I dug into this a little bit, from what I understand, it's the Jewish consensus is that a prophet or a spokesperson for God, they aren't able to properly transfer God's message to the intended audience unless they themselves become a vessel of mercy. And according to a midrash, Hosea needed to become mercy so that he could feel the weight of what God feels and understand God's patience and long-suffering when it comes to unfaithful Israel. So the sages have this midrash where it's this conversation, this supposed conversation between God and Hosea. And Hosea basically tells God, I think you should just give up on these northern tribes. You should just start over with somebody else because they're nothing but trouble. And so God wants the person who he's chosen to be his prophet, he wants him to understand the depth of his love for the people and why it is that he can't just give up. So he gives Hosea this task, I guess, about marrying Gomer. Now, I also didn't realize it's divided on whether or not this actually happened in real time, or it was a prophetic vision that Hosea had. So, and I wasn't there. I don't know. Did Hosea literally live through this with Gomer, or was it a prophetic vision, but one where Hosea felt every emotion? And the reason I can say that it doesn't matter to me either way if Hosea felt the emotion, the reason I can say that is I don't know if you've ever seen Star Trek, The Next Generation with Captain Picard, but there's this episode that I watched years and years ago. And he's standing on the bridge, the command center, and for I think it's maybe 15 minutes in real time, he goes into this trance, or he falls down, and maybe he's fallen, and they don't want to take him to sick bay. They don't want to move him. And in that 15-minute time, he lives an entire lifetime. So the episode shows him. He marries a woman. They have a child, grandchildren. I mean, this whole entire life, and he's living it as if it were his life. And then he's suddenly sort of transported back, in a sense, to reality, and has been told, you've been out for 15 minutes. And he says something to the effect of, but it was so real. So, in the end, did this happen to Gomer, or was it a prophetic vision that was so real? Either way, Hosea feels God's pain of betrayal, but he also feels that longing toward the one that he loves, because he loves Gomer. And he feels God's commitment that he has to those that he loves, even when those ones he loves betray him and are unfaithful to him. So the prophet gets the message. He becomes mercy. And then he can better deliver the messages that he needs to deliver to God. And that's kind of where I wanted to maybe camp out with you on this. Because, some of us are called to live lives where we face relational betrayal. And we're tasked with forgiveness, kind of in the same way. Maybe it's in your marriage, with your children, with family members, community members, no matter what. In those instances, it appears that it's holy ground to suffer as God does in this way. Now, please hear me. I'm not in any way suggesting that if what comes to your mind is an abusive situation, I'm not saying stay in an abusive situation so that you can act out the Hosea, Gomer, God, Israel scenario. That is not what I'm saying. So please hear me in that. I'm not talking about relationships that are abusive. I'm talking about the ones that are painful. And I guess the short, sweet message that I want to say is that, God sees your pain, and he has felt that kind of pain. And so I'm suggesting in that situation, if you have that in mind, that you don't forget to ask God for his strength and his wisdom, and that you can ask him to show you that you really are making a difference in that situation, if you are being asked by God to be mercy. And I believe that it's in those moments where we're called to be mercy in a situation that doesn't give us back anything. I think that's when we really need to remember God, practice that presence of God that I've talked about in some of the other lessons. That's where we take that slow breath in, that deep breath in, and a slow, longer breath out. And that's when we remember that God breathed on humanity in the garden, and that he still breathes on you today. And that's in those moments, I would encourage you to remember to sit with God in those moments where you're called to be mercy in a situation that's very, very hard. And sit with God until you feel settled in your spirit, that you can get up and continue to show love to that person. Now, I don't know who that person is in your life, but I know them in mine. And I know that God does have all those answers. So I'll see you next week.